Between 1890 and 1900, Greenwood experienced a population explosion over 300%, from 1,326 people in 1890 to 4,828 in 1900. In a speech given in Boston in 1899 to potential investors for the South, Henry Grady, the editor for the Atlanta Constitution, made this statement, quote, "There is a new South, not through protest against the old, but because of new conditions, new adjustments, and, if you please, new ideas and aspirations." End quote. The end of the Civil War in America brought many changes to life in the South, making adaptability paramount for the region to prosper. For Greenwood, that change came in the form of cotton mills. In order to understand those changes, one must evaluate the power that railroads brought to the area, the creation of the cotton mills, the roles of children, African American, and women in the mills, life in the mill village, and the resulting prosperity to the area. The first point to consider is how railroads brought power to Greenwood. Prior to the more extensive use of railways in 1890, the primary sources for distributing agricultural produce to market was by wagon loads and waterways. Most cotton was not used interregionally, but was shipped to southern seaports where it would be transferred to the Northeast or Europe. Between 1852 and 1929, Greenwood had 5 railways, which was more than anywhere else in the state. Greenville, Spartanburg, and Columbia had 3, and Charleston had 4 railways. The 5 in Greenwood were the Greenville and Columbia Railway, the Augusta and Knoxville Line, the Georgia, Carolina, and Northern Railway, which became part of the Seaport Airline Railway in 1901, the Ware-Shoals Railroad, and the Georgia and Florida Railroad. These were used to connect Greenwood to other surrounding areas and help to reduce freight charges. The next step is to evaluate the creation of the cotton mills. Greenwood was incorporated as a town in 1852. That's the same year that the first railroad came as well. In 1889, there were 2 building and loan companies which provided generous rates to borrowers. This, coupled with the fact that the closest mill to Greenwood was in Newberry, was instrumental for William Lowndes Durst in the creation of the first Greenwood cotton mill in 1891. The 75 people that were employed by the Greenwood mill were responsible for processing 5 bales of cotton a day on an 85 looms. By 1900, there were 384 looms in use, and by 1905, with the addition of the second mill, that number increased to 485 looms. The mill workers manufactured cotton and wool. They also made tools and machinery, built all of the mill buildings, and dealt with all the necessary business transactions. Employees began their day with a wake-up whistle at 4:30, began their 12-hour workday at 6 o'clock, and were allowed a 30-minute lunch break. Weekend shifts were shortened to 10-hour days. Durst was remembered at his death by the people of Greenwood as a man who was, quote, an industrial pioneer, a public benefactor, and a community builder, end quote. The next point of evaluation is the role of child labor in the mills. The employment of children was debated by middle and upper class families who had no need for extra income that child labor afforded. Mill families, however, were required to furnish at least 3 workers, or they would not be considered an asset to the company. Statute law of South Carolina stated that no child under the age of 12 should be employed unless there are necessitating circumstances for work. With that in mind, 95 out of the 150 mills in the South reported that 289 boys and 206 girls were working under the age of 12. These statistics are presumed as being those with certificates for work. In 1903, South Carolina adopted a child labor law because of the potential and real harm that it did to children. Permanent injury and the normal growth that a child would develop through play and socialization with other children was taken away. One area in which the law lacked was that children were not required to go to school, allowing some who were not on the payroll to evade the law by claiming that they were helping out their big brothers and sisters, they were under the guise of being there for safety, or simply because they wanted to learn. The next step is the role of African Americans in the mills. After the Civil War, Jim Crow laws allowed whites to subjugate African Americans in a form of legal slavery, which resulted in the Great Migration where African Americans moved north. Whites in the South had a cause for alarm because it meant that they were losing their agricultural labor force. This resulted in higher total labor wages because African Americans were paid a lower wage than whites. African Americans were often turned down for jobs in the mill because of their race or were given menial positions, and only made up 5.5% of the workforce in mills in 1907. African American women in this era worked as housekeepers, cooks, and caregivers to the elderly. The next step is to consider the role of women in the mill. Women had the double task of maintaining their homes as well as working in the mills. A bill was introduced in South Carolina that tried to prevent women from being able to work at night, but was rejected by the women who were employed at the mill because the night shift allowed them a chance at a job they might not otherwise have. World War I changed the dynamics of life for both white and black women in the mills. Voids were created in the workforce because the men had gone to war, which allowed white women to be promoted to supervisors and created an opening for black women that was previously inaccessible. Life in the mill village is the next point. Mill villages were necessary when they were first founded for the simple logistical reason of needing close proximity to the mills. In many mill villages, the housing conditions were poor at best. However, one of the things that set the Greenwood mill villages apart was that the communities were full of well-built brick homes, schools, and churches. These villages were self-contained communities that had company-owned stores in them as well as post offices and barbershops. And lastly, one must evaluate the resulting prosperity to the area. Greenwood became a county in 1897. This was the same year that the second mill, Greenwood Mill, was built. The 96 cotton mill came online in 1902, and by 1908, Greenwood had electric lights, telephones, 3 banks, 3 hotels, and 2 newspapers, the Greenwood Journal and the Greenwood Index, which formed a merger in 1919 as the Index Journal. 1908 was the year that James C. Self took over as president of the Greenwood Cotton Mills, and although the town was achieving great advancements, the mills were in desperate financial trouble to the extent that one had already closed and the other was on the verge of closure. An advancement to automatic loom technology by the Draper Company made machinery in Greenwood obsolete. When Self took over as president, he went to Massachusetts and worked out a deal with George Draper in order to bring the Greenwood cotton mills up to modern standards. In the space of 2 years between 1910 and 12, the profits for Greenwood cotton mills went from $199.30 to an astonishing increase of $46,600. Panola Mill was opened in 1910 under the leadership of Samuel H. McGee and changed ownership to John Pope Abney in 1921, who had purchased both the Grindle and 96 mills from A. Foster McKissick in 1917. He was the founding president of Abney Mills. The philosophy of Greenwood Mills was to produce a quality item that was based on the demands of the customer. This proved to be of paramount importance in World War II when the government sought out poplin cloth for the military. Greenwood Mills produced over 100 million yards of poplin fabric and received the Army-Navy Production Award, or E Award, 4 times. The prosperity of the Greenwood Mills provided not only wealth for Self, it also allowed him to create a foundation in 1942 that bears his name, a foundation whose goal is to establish many forms of benevolence for the Greenwood area, including a hospital, and to, quote, foster, encourage, promote, support, carry on, or conduct research in any or all of the medical arts and sciences, end quote. Through the power that railroads brought to the area, the creation of the cotton mills, the roles of children, African American and women in the mills, life in the mill village, one can see Greenwood as a prime example of how an area was able to adapt and make the necessary changes after the Civil War from agrarian to industrial life, all of which resulted in prosperity to the area and allowed it to become a model of the New South.